Some leaders leave footprints, others leave libraries. You're tuning into the Authors on Mission podcast, where industry giants become literacy legends. In every episode, we talk with authors who turn their brilliance into books that transform lives. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authors on Mission. Welcome to your authorship experience. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Authors on Mission podcast, the podcast committed to uncovering top-tier insights and strategies from experts who are transforming their fields through the written word. I'm your host, Danielle Hutchinson, Chief Creative Officer here at Authors on Mission, and today we're talking about a remarkable story of resilience, honesty, and mental health advocacy. My guest is Tyler Kania, author of the powerful memoir, The Maniac with No Knees. Tyler's going to take us on an unflinching story through his experiences with bipolar disorder from his days as a promising rugby player who suffered a completely rare knee injury, with his adventures across the country that eventually led to hospitalization and healing. It's a story about mastering meaning in madness, discovering unexpected strengths in our struggles, and the courage it takes to share our vulnerable truths. So this memoir really does balance dark humor with insights into mental health, offering everybody a fresh perspective on resilience and recovery. It's going to be an exciting conversation about the writing process and strength and healing and everything in between. Without further ado, Tyler, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Danielle. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited too. It's going to be a lot of fun chatting about you and all this experience. So, the first thing I always like to start off with is, if you don't mind giving us a little bit more insight about you and what led you to writing your story on paper. Obviously, you've had an incredible journey, difficult and strong and inspiring altogether, but why write a book?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long story, but I'll cut it down as best as I can. Was a pretty great rugby player, played the position fly half, which is similar to quarterback, and won a lot in college, got, recruited to play for a premier rugby team alongside Team USA stars and people from around the world, and ended up rupturing my patellar tendon for the first time. I actually did it twice. It's an injury that happens once for every 147,000 human years, so to do it twice, it's kind of like discovering life on other planets. But that sent me down a pretty dark path. It was the onset of my bipolar disorder, and, it was my first manic episode. And, I basically spent the next 8 years kind of oscillating between, having success in things like cybersecurity sales and making $250,000 and, leading a college rugby team to a conference championship, while also kind of reeling in my personal life and, eventually attempting suicide twice and landing in an institutional mental hospital where I finally, began to heal. But, met a lot of people there that suffered a lot worse than me. Schizophrenics, narcissists, people that needed electroshock therapy. My roommate had aphasia, and that's when a trauma prevents you from really talking much at all. And I actually got him to talk for the first time in several weeks. But that experience reminded me of all my blessings. I grew up in a wealthy, white, nuclear educated family, and, I'm an athlete with an innate sense of confidence. And a lot of these people just didn't have that. They were ashamed of who they were. They never really got opportunities to succeed. So I knew that I wanted to do something about it, but I didn't know how. And I was pretty ashamed of who I was at the time. But I got my life back together after my institutionalization. I got a job at the largest cybersecurity company in the world. And, I worked hard to get back on the rugby field. And, by spring of 2024, I was in the best shape of my life, ready to prove to everybody what I could do. And I ruptured my patellar tendon again. And that caused my first manic episode since being institutionalized. And mania is a powerful thing. It can be a superpower in some ways. Like, you don't care what other people think. You don't see risk. You just see a goal, and your mind works 1,000,000 miles per hour. You feel like you're God. And in the moment, I thought that I was going to prove myself to the world through rugby. And when that fell, I wanted to explain myself. I wanted to clear things up with all the people that I had confused over a decade. And so that manic episode inspired me to just open up the notes app on my iPhone and just started writing my life story and publishing it straight to Instagram. And I had to be hospitalized for that manic episode. But when I got out, I looked at my phone and I had all these notifications from people that had found inspiration in what I had to say and had no idea what I've been going through, and just a lot of encouragement. And I kind of knew at that time that, it would be my responsibility to put my story out to the world, offer hope for those that are struggling, and offer a better understanding for the general public around mental health.
Well, first off, I mean, I honor you for being able to put all of these really difficult things into the book for everybody to read. It's very raw and personal, and I'm sure it was not easy to tackle all this and, rehash it out in the book. That alone is a matter of strength. So I just commend you for that. People write about difficult topics all the time, but it never gets easier, right? Especially because you have to kind of relive and battle your inner demons, I guess, putting it onto the paper. I'm sure there was a lot of challenge with that, right?
Yeah, I mean, truthfully, I think it takes more strength to struggle in silence. And, for me, I felt liberated when I was able to share my story. I had hidden in the shadows for so long, and I had never shared what I had been going through. People were completely shocked, but writing to me is a lot like therapy. Therapy is nothing more than a mirror for your thoughts. That's what writing is basically. So it's really a blessing that I was able to find this tool, and the community that I built around it has been really powerful.
Right. And, one thing you did mention also is another motivation behind it was kind of sharing your story with the ones who, needed some more understanding behind it. So in a way, I guess you could say that this is not only a book that people can learn from and, build themselves up from, but also it allows you to share your perspective and kind of, reveal the hidden truths that other people wouldn't have understood. So it's another motivating layer, I guess you could say.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I get to kind of control the narrative when I'm writing and tell people my point of view, because mental illness can just be confusing to everybody, involved if they're not familiar with it.
Yeah, exactly. And so you do a wonderful job of shining a light onto that. So that being said, I think we should talk a little bit about the contents of the book yourself. I was looking through it a bit, and, one of the most striking things upon opening the book is that you write about being lucky to have a knee injury because, you mentioned earlier in this podcast it happens once every 147,000 human years. Was that intentional, and how did that reflect your approach to adversity? And because lucky could be kind of a word that goes back and forth a little bit, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and that's not the only thing that I said I was lucky about. I said I'm lucky for having been suicidal for 6 years, and lucky for not being able to hold a job and have substance abuse problems. And, as far as my knees go, I had great ambitions for rugby, and it was my passion. And I thought that I would be on, TV and playing for a national team and stuff like that, but it didn't work out that way, but at the end of the day, everything that's happened to me in my past has made me stronger. It's built up my resilience, and it brought me to where I am today, having published a book. And
Right.
my story is unique. Not many people go through the whole scope of everything that I've been dealt in life. But, I look at it like a statue, and the statue starts off as a block of marble, and then it gets chipped away and poked and stabbed, and, eventually it turns into this beautiful piece of art. And so I think with everybody in life, it's our failures and our struggles that turn us into better people. If times are always good, we don't learn, and we don't get better. We only get better through not succeeding and learning from it.
Yeah, I like that. I love that metaphor too, right? Chipping away. And that's a beautiful kind of way to frame it. For anybody listening today, that's something you could apply to your own lives. It's a good perspective to have and very hopeful too. I really do like that. So based on everything that I've been looking through the book as well, it really does seem that you do have a positive framing for all of this. You discuss, seeing the glass half full regarding everything, clearly from what you just said. But what kind of tips and strategies do you have for others who might have trouble seeing it in that light? I mean, I'm sure, it didn't come naturally to see it positively. So how did you grow and come to that conclusion?
Yeah, well, I got a two-part answer. The
Okay.
first part is if you're struggling, there's three things that worked for me, as far as fixing, my troubles and getting to stability. The first thing is you need a community around you that allows you to be yourself and, let your hair down and just be relaxed, people that motivate you and have your back. It's really important. We're social creatures, and when you're struggling, it's really easy to disassociate yourself from the world, stay in your room, keep your cell phone turned off, turned down, invites to parties and stuff like that. But, if you read my book, you'll find the magic that happens when I was able to leave my room and I was able to, enjoy the human experience alongside others. The second thing is you need a goal. You need to wake up every morning and have something that forces you to strive for a better version of yourself, and something that keeps you going and motivated and is kind of the light at the end of the tunnel. And it doesn't really matter if you achieve that goal or not. It's the journey, and then it's knowing that you gave everything that you had to try and achieve it. And then the third thing is if you suffer from mental health, you need, medication. And that's a tough pill to swallow, no pun intended, for a lot of people, because psychiatric illnesses are tough to prescribe medication for. Things work for different people. I cycled through over a dozen medications before I was able to find the right one. One medication was an early stage trial antipsychotic that turned me gay for 3 months, and I had never been gay, so it was a really jarring experience. But eventually, when I was institutionalized and formally diagnosed with bipolar 1, I was prescribed, lithium, which is a mood stabilizer, and an antipsychotic, and, a few other things. And I finally did get that stability. And I'm confident that if I didn't find lithium, I would be dead right now. So, some people don't need medication, but others just have a chemical imbalance in their brain, and it's a necessary thing to go for.
That's a very powerful thing to think about, because some people are against medication or say, you shouldn't need to, or, there's a whole debate out there right now, but you make a good point for it. Sometimes you need a little bit of assistance to balance what's going on. And I am sorry that you had to go through so many trials and errors with that, but you make a good point. You have to kind of see what works best for you. And sometimes you need a little bit of that assistance. So just
Yeah,
something to think about too.
definitely.
Yeah. And, if you're listening today, everybody, Tyler just gave us a huge array of tips. And if you are struggling and you need something like this, you can pick up his book, because Tyler, I can only imagine you go into even more detail about these tips and how it affected you and your life. And it can only help others tremendously if they do dive into the texts. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. So, kind of branching into the writing process now, you did mention that you started writing this on the notes app of your phone, which, funny enough, is something that I think a lot of people might do as soon as they're inspired to write, picking up whatever's near them and finding some type of medium to just get it down. So how was that process going from translating it from the notes app and, whatever's jumped up in your mind to getting it onto a full-fledged book? Was there an outlining process? What kind of strategies did you use?
Well, the whole first draft was published to Instagram, and a lot of these people were my friends. So a lot of the story was framed in different ways and kind of giving recognition to people that helped me along the way. But once I decided to actually turn it into a book and, throw it into Microsoft Word, I had to fix a lot of things in order to make it more palatable for the general public and, strangers who didn't know me. I had never written a book. I had no connection to anybody in, the publishing or writing industry. But I woke up every morning and I never once had a writer's block. I just kind of inherently knew what I wanted to say. And it was really just an awesome experience. The proclivity that I went through during that period was immense. But eventually, I found a friend of a friend, a rugby player who, does edit books. And I brought him on as my structural editor. And he really pushed me to, think beyond the narrative, think intrinsically about how I was feeling during certain, manic episodes or depressive states, and also how the people around me were feeling when I was, insane. And some of that was a tough thing to address because I only know my experience, and it does hurt to know, some of the negative ways that you implicated people around you. But it was important for me to not be biased in my messaging. There's a couple villains in the story, but I do my best to share their side of things too.
It's amazing that you have a well-rounded perspective of it. And I guess as a sidebar there, I wanted to mention it's wonderful that you had a editor who kind of saw your side of things too, being that he was also a rugby player. So,
Yeah.
just a tip to all of our listeners that, if you have somebody on your team and you're working with an editor, a beta reader, publisher, it's always good to have somebody who understands your story, even if it is just the extent of the rugby aspect. He's been in your world a little bit, so he knew. So it's
Yeah.
great to have that partnership. But yeah, I mean, balancing it out, like you just mentioned too, it's challenging to do, but you were able to see both sides, and you mentioned that the villains versus you, and it's good to share light on their perspectives. Definitely. So this also isn't your first book. You have a couple others, including a second book, 99 Stories and a Broken Pen. I was wondering if you wanted to share a little bit about these other books on your list.
Yeah, well, yeah, The Maniac with No Knees is my first book, and that's the only one that's published right now.
Oh,
But, 99 Stories and a Broken Pen is collection of one-page micro stories. There's 99 of them, and, it ranges on everything from suicide and mental illness and addiction to love and sports and politics. And really, it was kind of something that goes back to a high school teacher of mine who would just kind of give us one word or a phrase, and we had to write one page about it. And so I kind of took from that a little, and it was a bit inspired by, delivering my content to Instagram and realizing that people like the short form content. There's a lot of non-readers out there that will read a page. And so I'm excited about this one. I've got my 99 stories, but I'm still looking for improvements as far as like maybe finding ones that are a little weak and replacing them with, better stories. So I'm taking my time on that one. I'm in no rush to put it out there anytime soon, but I've got plenty of other ideas. I want to work on a book called Conversations in Waffle House, which will be kind of like a anthropological look at the South through the lens of, the most unhinged restaurant in the country. And it kind of, the inspiration from that came from when I was living down south in Memphis and, just witnessing all the crazy things that go on in Waffle Houses. And then besides that, I've been writing extended obituaries for people, like short stories to capture the life of a deceased family member for, their family to, preserve the memories. And, that's a lot of fun. And it's tough to make money as an unknown writer, but, there's kind of two occasions when money doesn't matter, and that's marriage and death. So I've kind of found a niche there.
that's really amazing that you did find that niche. Well, first off, if you're listening today and you're interested in any of these works, I'm sure that we could find some more updates and information for when they will be released to us. Is there a certain place we can look for those?
Yeah, I mean, my ground zero for everything writing is still Instagram. That's where I publish all my work for the first time for the most part. Besides that, you can visit tylerkania.com, tylerkania.com. None of those things are available yet, but when they are, they'll be posted on the website.
Great. Okay. And the Instagram handle is what again? So that we
Oh,
all.
sorry, yeah. Tyler_Kania, Kania.
Perfect. Well, we'll put that in the description box too, everybody, so you can go ahead and click on over there after the podcast is complete, of course. But, very interesting that you also do, obituaries and that sort of thing. As a ghostwriter myself, I write books and, that sort of thing. But it's interesting to write an obituary because I can see how that's something very personal and it has to be very profound and accurately reflect that person's life. So if you want to shed a little more light on that, because that's something I think a lot of authors can benefit from, the idea of adapting your language to accommodate for whoever it is that you need to write about.
Yeah, they're typically 10 to 12 pages long. There's a few pictures in the book of, the person it's about. And what I do is I interview 3 or 4 family members. I interview a couple friends. These things can be a little dark to write about sometimes, so I always ask for funny stories to include in them. And you do have to be careful, especially when it was an untimely death. I'm running into situations where there might be culpability for one person involved, and you don't want them to read it and, just feel guilt. So you have to be a little careful about, what you're going to put down about somebody who's no longer with us. I think I have a good approach and a good mindset when I'm approaching it, and the people that I've written about it so far, their families really love what I have to say.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing that. And it is something that anybody, for example, if they're listening today and they were interested in, your services for that, they could also perhaps get in touch with you via the same website.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so everybody, if what Tyler is saying does resonate with you, you not only can pick up the book, but also perhaps you have an opportunity to help him shine some light on a loved one's life as well. And that's another enterprise that you can get into with Tyler here. So Tyler, I'm wondering, what might be next year? I know you're working on a couple other books. Is there any particular one that might be coming out sooner rather than others that we can take a look and be excited for and be on the lookout for?
Yeah, like I'm keeping my options open. Like I said, I'm going to take my time with the short story collection. I do want to diversify my work a bit, not necessarily write strictly about mental illness, but, show my range. And, so that's kind of where the Conversations in Waffle House comes in. That requires me to take a couple trips down south. So I've got to plan that one out still. But in the meantime, I'm writing every day. I'm trying to think of new inspirations. And, I just started covering a softball league for the local newspaper. So, I'm busy, I guess.
That's good. It's good to keep busy and to always have something up your sleeve, I guess you could say. So everybody, again, check out those links and stay up to date with it because, it's going to happen one way or another, scheduling it in. Tyler, I'm wondering, do you happen to have any tips for aspiring authors like yourself? You told me that you never had really seen yourself as a writer before this, and the pieces just fell into place. But perhaps by walking us through that process, we could also learn from what you did and how you accomplished this.
Yeah, so, I was never really book smart, really. Like, I was an athlete. That's what I cared about. I had ADHD and was a bit of a class clown. But my brother was, he could finish a novel in one trip to the bathroom. He won the state geography bee when he was in 4th grade, competing against 8th graders, and got a perfect score on the reading and writing of his SATs. And he's a lawyer now. But when I got really depressed, I didn't want to be in my world, so I wanted to go to other people's worlds. And I really benefited from my brother's library at home. And, I kind of entered this period of reading 300 pages of literature every single day. I read Infinite Jest in a week and a half, and I was just cruising through epics, all different genres, really. And, if you want to write, you got to read stuff first. You got to learn what your writing strategy is going to be and what makes a good story. And you got to have a good, vocabulary. So that was kind of the foundation for things. But now that I'm doing it as much as possible, it's just like write every day and you're going to get better. My first book, The Maniac with No Knees, like I said, I was learning things on the go. And looking back now, there's, things that I would change to the prose or things that I would add in. But I've continued to develop just because if you do anything, a lot, you're going to improve. And so you just got to find that passion for writing, and you got to be willing to write about as many different things as possible, right? Like I'm writing a memoir, short stories, obituaries, softball articles, and eventually you figure out what sticks. You learn something from each new piece that you put together, and you just keep going. And besides that, like there's a lot of things that I've learned along the way, like using different things like Grammarly, editing to kind of help with the sentences. And yeah, and definitely, be willing to share your work. Like, I got encouragement from all the people in my Instagram community. And when you're writing things to people, you gotta make sure it's edited. The first draft of everything is gonna be bad. And a book isn't really finished until you're sick of reading it, you know?
Yeah.
So you just got to have that patience.
Yeah, it's all about that patience and that process. And I do like what you said about you have to read also. And, by getting ideas and inspiration and tips from other authors, that's a great way to improve yourself too. So, thank you for sharing that process. I think, again, anybody listening today can implement that, incorporate that into their own writing process. Something different works for everybody. And sometimes it's a matter of experimenting and seeing, what exactly does work. And clearly you're a great example of that, because here you are now with, all these books and either published or in the process, and, you've got it down, I guess. Well, I guess you could always be improving, but you seem to have it all settled now. So I'm wondering specifically, what advice would you give to somebody writing about their own mental health journeys or challenging topics, but are hesitant to be as vulnerable as you are? I know you mentioned to you it was therapeutic, but that might not be the case for everybody else. So perhaps, do you have any advice for those?
Yeah, I was really bewildered by the response that I received when I first started putting my stuff out there. Sure, there's been people that form judgments around me or aren't interested in my struggle, but overwhelmingly, it's been support and it's been encouragement, and it's really made my life a lot easier, because it's allowed me to be honest with myself and feel accepted for who I am despite what I go through. It's like I said earlier, like, it's a lot easier to put yourself out there than it is to hide in the shadows. And if you're struggling and you're afraid of how people are going to react, just understand that everybody goes through some struggle in their life, and people gravitate towards those that are authentic.
Right. And that's about pretty much all we can do, is to be authentic and be ourselves and just describe whatever story it is as naturally as you can and clearly. And that's how you would relate to your readers. Thank you for sharing that. I know that it's a hard thing to do, but with the right guidance and the right mindset, you can get your story out there. So thank you for that. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience today? Anything they can kind of take home with them and implement as soon as this podcast is over and take to heart?
No, not really. I mean, I guess earlier I wanted to say that, if you're struggling with mental health and you're trying to see the half full glass, it's important to understand your strengths. And I think that what I've realized is that bipolar people and mentally ill people have superpowers in some ways. It's no wonder why so many successful people like Winston Churchill and Ernest Hemingway and Vincent van Gogh and Selena Gomez were bipolar. We have a heightened level of creativity, curiosity, empathy, objectivity. And when we're manic, we feel as powerful as God. And mania can be a bad thing, but, mania is also the reason why I have a book out there for the world. So, just remember who you are, and don't worry about the things that, are shitty about yourself. Focus on those good things, and you'll realize that your illness is a blessing.
Your illness is a blessing. I like that. And that's kind of the positive approach that you've put in this book and this podcast. And it's a good way to think about it and to really see it as something to grow from and learn from, rather than a detriment. So
Yeah.
I love the positivity and the optimism. It's a great way to not only approach life, but to also approach your writing as well. So I appreciate that.
Definitely.
It really has been a pleasure talking with you, learning about your story, and of course, talking about tips for everybody to apply to their own lives, regardless of where you might be. So thank you so much for that. Your candor and vulnerability is inspiring. It's been a pleasure.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And again, to our listeners, please check out the links in the description box. Check out The Maniac with No Knees on Amazon and other retailers. And also remember that at Authors on Mission, we believe that stories like Tyler's change lives. They remind us that expertise comes in many forms. Sometimes our greatest contributions come from sharing our most authentic selves, struggles, triumphs, and everything else. Tyler shows us that our mission to empower others to find their voice and share their unique experience with the world is something we should all be doing. So thank you for listening. Remember, your story matters. And until next time, keep writing, keep sharing, and keep making an impact. Check out our next episode here at Authors on Mission.
This is Danielle Hutchinson reminding you that somewhere, someone needs the book that only you can write. Visit authorsonmission.com to start your legacy. Until next time, keep leading, keep inspiring, and keep thinking in chapters. Have a great day.